Bene, ben trovati a questo nuovo appuntamento con i video podcast di Appunti. È una puntata davvero speciale questa, perché anche questa sarà in inglese, quindi lo dico per quelli di voi che magari si spaventano all'idea, ma è una puntata a cui tengo molto perché parleremo di un libro importantissimo che è appena uscito di nuovo in italiano. Il libro si chiama Guerre, giuste e ingiuste, una discussione morale con esempi storici, ed è un libro scritto dal filosofo americano Michael Walzer. Lo pubblica in italiano Garzanti, è un libro sorprendentemente attuale, utilissimo per capire quello che sta succedendo, ma è un libro scritto nel 1977 che ha già animato molte discussioni negli anni, sia quando è uscito, quindi durante la guerra del Vietnam, sia nelle fasi successive in cui ci si è confrontati con la grande questione di fondo. Esistono guerre giuste e esistono guerre ingiuste. Michael Walzer è un intellettuale noto in tutto il mondo, è un filosofo americano, è professore emerito all'Institute for Advanced Study a Princeton e ha insegnato appunto a Princeton e a Harvard. È stato anche editor della rivista Dissent ed è uno appunto delle voci più influenti nel dibattito, diciamo così, in senso lato del campo progressista. L'approccio del libro, adesso ne parliamo, abbiamo il piacere di parlarne con il professor Walzer che si collega da New York, ma vi dico solo due coordinate per capire di cosa parleremo. L'approccio del libro fondamentale consiste nel cercare di capire se esistono guerre giuste e ingiuste, qual è il nostro approccio morale alle guerre, e separa distintamente i due principali modi di guardare alla guerra. Una guerra può essere giusta o ingiusta nelle sue ragioni, cioè quello che si chiama ius ad bellum, quindi e qui l'aggressione è praticamente sempre, o meglio, forse sempre una ragione sbagliata e ingiustificabile, mentre una guerra difensiva è giustificabile. E poi una guerra può essere giusta o ingiusta per i modi in cui è combattuta. Questo riguarda un po' tutto quello di cui stiamo parlando in questi anni, dalle uccisioni dei civili agli attacchi mirati, alle uccisioni dei generali avversari, come fa per esempio l'esercito ucraino a Mosca, riguarda l'uso della bomba atomica, riguarda la guerra di Gaza e Israele. Quindi questa distinzione ha permesso a Michael Walzer di recuperare una tradizione molto antica, che è quella dell'idea della guerra giusta, che era stata un po' abbandonata nell'auspicio, ovviamente non coerente con quello che poi abbiamo visto, che non ci sarebbero più state guerre, o che si potessero fermare tutte le guerre e quindi considerarle tutte ingiuste. Come sempre potete mettere le vostre domande nella chat, che io guarderò, potete metterle anche in italiano, e con il professor Walzer cercheremo di rispondervi. Ok, welcome here at Appunti, Professor Walzer. It's a true honor to have you here. And the opportunity for our conversation comes from the Italian new edition of your extremely famous book. So, first of all, I would like to ask you to describe the context when you wrote this book, when this book was published for the first time in 1977. The Vietnam War was ongoing. So, what led you to study war from a moral perspective? How your book was different from anything else that was appeared before, and how did you engage with such a complex effort?
Yes, well, a lot of questions there. Actually, the story probably goes back to the simple fact that I grew up during World War II, um, uh, fascinated by the war. World War II was a kind of immunization against pacifism. Because I was convinced, even at 10 years old, that the fight against Nazism was a necessary and just war, And if there are necessary and just wars, then pacifism is not a possible political position. So that's where it all started. But
Mhm.
the book begins in 1967, 10 years before its publication. I was a young lefty running around the country giving speeches against the Vietnam War. And suddenly I was also giving speeches defending the Israeli preemptive strike against Egypt. And people thought that was contradictory. How could you be against one war and sympathetic to another? And I had to explain that there are just and unjust wars. And that started me thinking about how to defend the difference, explain the difference. Um, I went back to reading Catholic just war theory. I spent 10 years reading military history, talking to soldiers, reading novels and poems about the warfare. And in 77, the book came out. Um, and to my astonishment, it was within a few months adopted as a required text at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
Mm.
Um, and then I began visiting West Point and talking to the officers there, um, many of whom had been in Vietnam and had been disturbed by the war. Some of them agreed with my criticism, but some of them disagreed. But they all thought that the cadets should read the arguments.
Mhm.
But
There is one important point that you make extremely explicit in the essay that is at the end of the Italian edition of your book, where you explain why war is a different moment, a different thing from any other way of living together. Why, if we try to compare our peacetime experiences with what happens in war, it doesn't work. And if I understood correctly, you reached this conclusion exactly because you moved out from the very realm of philosophy and you started talking to real people in real wars. So can you explain why war is different from living conflict and dealing with conflict in peacetime?
yes, yes, it is an important argument, and it's an argument that I have with a number of philosophers who think they are or call themselves revisionists and treat me as if I am the orthodox just war theorist. Look, consider an encounter uh, um, in domestic society, a bank robbery. You have the bank robber who is acting unjustly. You have a bank guard who is defending the bank and therefore acting justly. Um, the rules of engagement do not apply equally, similarly to to the robber and the guard. The guard can, if necessary, can fire his gun. The bank robber can't, shouldn't, since he is engaged in a criminal activity. War is not like that. Soldiers fighting a just war and soldiers fighting an unjust war are subject to the same moral constraints on the battlefield. On the battlefield, and that's a we don't after the war, we don't punish soldiers who fought in an unjust war. We don't punish them unless they committed specific war crimes. But we don't punish them just for shooting at the
Mhm.
enemy. Um,
Which means that if we apply to the Vietnam War, for example, it was an unjust war for its reasons, but then it doesn't mean necessarily that every soldier fighting in that war behaved unjustly, if I
right,
understood correctly.
right.
So you can be a good soldier in a terrible war, and a terrible soldier in a very good war or in a resistance war, and so on.
Yeah.
And this, I mean, you argue this for many pages in very convincing way, but I think that this remains one of the most controversial part of your book, because it means if we apply it to current wars that you can have a just Russian soldier and an unjust Ukrainian soldier. So what are the most effective objections to this theory that you received it during years?
Well, the objections are the simple moral intuition that a lot of people have, that soldiers fighting in an unjust war have no right to fight. They are engaged in a criminal activity. It's exactly like the bank robber. And even if we're not going to uh, send them to prison when the war is over, nonetheless, they should be subject to moral condemnation. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know exactly what that would mean on the battlefield. I suspect that the revisionists would not disagree with me very much on what should go on actually on the battlefield. I sometimes feel that the argument we're having is an academic argument, um, but it is. It has been very engaging on, at least at the academic level, in American philosophy, and possibly in other countries also. Um,
No, I agree with you that these differences are super relevant when actual wars erupt. For example, here in Italy, all the discussion about Ukraine and Russia has always been framed in there is an aggressor and there is a victim of the aggression, and that's it. And that is enough to understand what's going on. While, I mean, this is a very powerful distinction that for many people is more than enough to take a stance and to take a moral position. And reading your book, readers will see that things are a little bit more nuanced and more complex. So your points are still relevant today. So if we try to summarize this 50 years long reflection on war, how would you make your distinction between just and unjust war operative? I mean, you see a war and how you use your framework to take a position.
yes, you're asking questions about not the conduct of the war, but the reasons for going to war.
Both of them I'm interested in.
Yes, yes, but let's do the first first.
Mhm.
Uh, so wars are just if they are wars of defense against an unprovoked attack. Um, and that is the crucial justification for war is self-defense. But we have extended that justification to include the defense of others against unjust attacks. So I have argued for what are called humanitarian interventions to stop a massacre, to stop an ongoing atrocity. Um, I thought that there should have been some kind of military intervention in the Sudan. Um, I defended the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia to stop the killing, to shut down the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge. I defended the Indian intervention in East Pakistan, what became Bangladesh, against a brutal repression. So the defense, your self-defense, collective self-defense is one justification for war, and the defense of others in ultimate situations like mass killing. Um,
But what do you think about, for example, the Russian argument that the war in Ukraine is some form of self-defense because NATO expanded too close to Russia and it became a security threat? So the perception of insecurity and the perception of risk, is it something objective or it's something that depends on how a country and the people think about what they define as collective security and territorial integrity?
yeah, that is the Russian argument, and I don't think it holds water, even as a description of the actual fear
Mhm,
of ordinary Russians in the face of NATO expansion. But this is a longer argument. NATO expansion was not the product of American or Western imperialism. There was It was much more a response to demands for protection from East European countries and governments. Um, the Russians now are defending essentially a kind of sphere of influence argument,
mhm,
which we also see unhappily here in the United States. Um, but what they want is what Stalin got in 1945. In 1945, the US and Great Britain recognized a Russian sphere of influence across Eastern Europe. Um, and the Russians made a mess of it. Uh, Instead of protecting Eastern Europe, they exploited and repressed um, East European countries and provoked resistance, um, which led, with other things, um, to the downfall of the Soviet Union.
mhm.
Putin wants to reconstruct that that sphere of influence, um, and I find it very distressing that some American leftists who oppose any kind of American sphere of influence in Latin America are prepared to defend a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Um, NATO is essentially a defensive organization. I think the decision of the Swedes and the Finns to join is evidence of that that sense in Europe that a defensive organization is justified, is necessary because of Russian irredentism.
Mhm.
Um, so,
And also maybe we can add that countries have a right, a moral right to territorial integrity, but they have no moral right to sphere of influence. So it's not something that naturally belong to any big country, because this in this time where Donald Trump and the U.S. national security strategy uh, are quoting the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, it is become like and something which pretend to sound obvious, that big countries have the right to decide on their own sphere of influence, but it's not something that have any sound base, correct? I mean, there is no reason to argue that.
No, certainly not. And that's an important argument to make right now in the United States.
Mm-mm. And we discussed so far the reason behind the war and how they are different. But I was particularly, in a way, moved by some pages of your book where you describe how actual soldiers uh, behave in actual wars. And you basically say that they do not always act as we think. They are not always ready to kill the enemy in any moment possible. They do not always try to shoot and to kill and to massacre people on the other side. They just do that in some specific circumstances when they act as soldiers and not as human being. And which I mean, I never thought about that, but it means that even during war, you remain a human being with some form of how to say a common feeling with other human beings. How do you explain that, this contradiction, and why we celebrate people acting in certain way and not in others? Sometimes, if a soldier kills, for example, 10 enemy soldiers, he's a hero, and sometimes this is not relevant.
It isn't really a question only of humanity, but also of professionalism. Um, Soldiers have a code of honor. They fight against other soldiers, and they are supposed to, and many of them actually try to minimize harm to innocent men and women, to civilians who are not engaged in warfare. And that is the crucial rule of what we call jus in bello, or the rule that governs the conduct of war. War must be waged against warriors and not against the civilian population. Um, and if you talk to soldiers describing their battlefield experience, most of them will say that they try uh, to honor that distinction, to aim as best they can at military targets, and to try as best they can to minimize damage to civilian targets and to civilian lives. And that the judgment we make of the conduct of war hangs a great deal on how we judge those commitments. Um, Civilians die in war. The question is always, is there an effort to minimize those deaths, a positive effort by the army to minimize those deaths?
Mhm.
And
But
in Vietnam, when you see something like the My Lai massacre, what you're seeing is a deliberate violation of that
mhm.
fundamental rule.
But what do you think about the fact that now wars are less and less a human experience, and it's going to be more mediated by drones, algorithm, artificial intelligence? So you lose this common belonging to humanity, and you just ask soldiers to program and to prepare automatic weapons that will maximize their own function, which maybe is to kill all the terrorists they can find, all the enemy soldiers in whatever situation, even if they are with their children or with civilian people. So if we fight war with drones, maybe they will become even more bloody war than we expect. So it's not a clean war, a war that is fought with algorithm and
Well,
machines.
I think we should probably talk about asymmetric warfare before we talk about the
Yeah,
new.
sure. Let's start with asymmetric war. Correct.
Yes. And an asymmetric war is a war between a high-tech army, the army of a state, like the American army, the French in Algeria, the Israelis in Gaza, a high-tech army against a low-tech or lower-tech insurgency. Um, the insurgents fight from, they don't wear uniforms, they fight from civilian cover. The high-tech army does most of the killing and usually loses the war or fails to win the war.
Hmm.
And the examples are the French in Algeria, the Americans in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, the Israelis in Gaza again and again. Um, and the really difficult question for the high tech army is how you fight against an enemy that has embedded itself in the civilian population, how you make the distinction that is supposed to be made in combat.
Mhm.
Um, and basically, I think all of these armies have, to some degree, tried and to a large degree failed to make that distinction, um, and that's why they don't win. Because the asymmetric warfare is a political as well as a military struggle. And if you, as there's a famous quote from an American colonel in Afghanistan who said, the more civilians we kill, the more certain it is that we will lose the war.
Mhm.
And that's the dilemma of asymmetric warfare. Um, Experienced in different ways in each of those situations. Now, if you use drones, in principle, could make um, the distinction easier. Um, if you fly a drone um, over, say, an insurgent encampment, um, and you can follow the and there are civilians there, but from the air you can distinguish perhaps the
Mhm.
military leaders. You can hit just them. Somebody sitting in a hut, a high tech hut in Kansas, in the middle of the U.S., can launch an attack on a Viet Cong officer in what 7,000 miles away, um, and hit one person and
Mhm.
not anyone else. Uh, in principle, in principle. Now, drones are not being used that way in Ukraine and Russia. They're not being used against specific individual, highly focused targets. They are being used as the way bombs are. They are a very effective way of delivering explosives to. You can hit an apartment building, or you can hit an electricity plant, or
And how do you explain that? I mean, you have a very precise weapon where you can kill exactly those that you want to kill. And on the opposite, I mean, Russian, but also other countries use them as bombs just to kill civilians or to destroy buildings. It's just because they are extremely cheap,
they
or
yes,
there are other reasons.
um, they are cheap. They are uh, effective. Um, y- y- the, they have been introduced. See, how should I put it? They were designed initially for asymmetric warfare. They were designed to enable a high-tech army to hit insurgent forces without killing civilians. That was the idea. Now
Mhm.
they're being used in conventional warfare. They're being used not it's not an individual drone that is guided by a high tech a technician 5,000 miles away. They are being used as massive weapons for conventional attacks on cities, um, on crucially right now on electricity and oil, on the sources of power, but also on civilian targets in order to terrorize the civilian population. So they were designed to avoid terrorism, and they have become terrorist weapons.
Mhm. Even if they're used from by a government and not by an insurgent groups. So
Yeah,
since I mean all your analysis about what Russia is doing in Ukraine led to the conclusion that this is an unjust war from both perspectives. It's an unjust war because of its reasons and an unjust war because of the military tactics that the Russian army uses. So what about uh, Ukrainian allies? What are we doing in Ukraine? Are we supporting a country to resist? Are we supporting a country to win? Or are we fighting a proxy war? Because there are all these positions in the spectrum, and in your book, you discuss the very thin line between supporting an ally to resist and interfering with other countries' politics or situations. So I see that there is some confusion also in European leaders because the usual message is we help Ukraine to resist and then they will decide what to do. But I mean, their options are limited by the entity of our support. So if we do not give them missiles or patriots and so on, they can choose just to fight and lose or to fight and resist for a while. But if we give them full support, they have much more options. So how do you see this dilemma? What are we doing there?
well, I think the the effort of that as I understand it, President Biden led um, in with with European support and sometimes European leadership. That effort was an effort to enable Ukraine to win, um, or to win at least to force uh, uh, some kind of negotiation which would guarantee Ukrainian sovereignty. Um, and it was an effort that was from the outside because Russia is a nuclear power. Um, I mean, in other situations, when the Nazis invaded Poland, there was a military response, not very effective, but still a military response from France and Britain. Um, the response to the Russian invasion was one of supporting Ukrainian resistance, but not engaging Russian forces. Had Russia been a different kind of power, had this been a pre nuclear age, I think the right response would have been to send troops into Ukraine and aim for a decisive defeat and short term, a quick defeat of the Russian invasion. That's not possible in a nuclear age. So the Europeans and Americans, opted for support from a distance, material support, which the United States is now in the process of abandoning or reducing dangerously. And I think material support was, in the circumstances, the right thing to do. It could have been done in a bigger way, faster, um, and with more economic pressure.
Why do you say that a direct intervention was impossible because of the nuclear threat? You mean that a conventional war in Ukraine would have led to a nuclear war by definition? Because I mean, sometimes we hear Putin saying this is a red line, this is a red line. We basically crossed all those red lines. We as European and Americans gave to Ukrainians fighting jets and anti-missiles batteries. I mean, everything that Putin said it was a red line, and nothing truly happened. So nuclear deterrence works only until there is a direct conflict between nuclear powers, or can remain a deterrence also if these great powers, conflict with traditional means.
Yes, it is, as you say, the red lines have been passed, but not the ultimate red line of active military
Okay.
intervention and a clear, uh, imminent defeat for the Russians. They might not have used their nuclear weapons, but it was a threat that we were not prepared
To
to
deal with.
in
Okay.
some ways. If you look back to 1956, the Hungarian uprising, um, and the West watched um, and did nothing, and it was because Russia was a nuclear power.
Mhm. Okay, so there is a long list of precedents. Okay, so you said at the beginning of the conversation that your book actually started as a project with the 1967 war against Israel, and I mean the 1967 war. So now Israel is in the middle of multiple conflicts, one in Gaza, and many other regional conflicts that are always on the brink of becoming something bigger and maybe out of control. So, what? How do you apply your framework to what has happened so far in Israel, both in Gaza and, for example, with Iran? So, is the response to the October 7 a just war for Israel because there was an existential threat in terms of jus ad bellum? So I don't. This is not related to what Israel actually did afterwards. And for example, the attack to Iran, was it a just war? Is it? If we are there again, might be a just war again. Then we discuss how Israel actually behaved. But in terms of how to respond, what do you think?
Yes. Well, first of all, the attack of October 7th was um, not only a Hamas attack, um, what the Iranians call the axis of resistance declared a war against Israel on October 7th. It was an uncoordinated war. Hamas apparently did not trust its allies in Lebanon and Iran with the actual date of its attack. And so the attack was uncoordinated, but it was supported immediately with low-level attacks from Hezbollah against northern Israel, and it was supported in principle and with material support from Iran, which that day declared its commitment to the destruction of Israel. So there was an uncoordinated, but nonetheless three-state or three-agent attack on Israel that day, and I think there was a right to respond militarily to Hamas, to Hezbollah, and to Iran at any point when Israel felt capable of doing that. Now, that says nothing about the conduct of the responses, but in terms of jus ad bello, in terms of the justification for military responses, October 7 was a general justification.
Mhm. But I mean, this, as you correctly remembered, it was a much broader attack than just Hamas versus Israel. But the response in the different war theaters were completely different. So in Gaza, we had an asymmetric war. With Iran, we have a more traditional war or preemptive strike and all these things, not always preemptive.
Right.
In Lebanon, with against Hezbollah, we had a more, how to say, precision, intelligence, military operation, completely different. So, how do you evaluate the conduct from a moral perspective in all these different situations? Because, I mean, in Gaza, what makes think difficult from a moral philosophy perspective is that anything that you do in Gaza will lead to dramatic consequences, basically, because it's an asymmetric war. And as you said before, if you have a big army with big technology and big weapons that try to find terrorists among civilians, that usually will never end well. So, how do you? What's your analysis about all these different responses?
Yes, well, we have to focus on Gaza because that is where the world has focused. And this was, as you say, an asymmetric war, a very unusual asymmetric war, because in addition to embedding itself to an extreme degree in the civilian population of the Gaza cities, Hamas also constructed an underground city. We call it the tunnels, but it was unprecedented. 3 levels of tunnels, um, much of it um, uh, provided with fresh air. Uh, an amazing achievement, a technological achievement that I don't understand how Israel ever permitted, but it meant that the the cities above ground were all of them human shields, collective human shields for the city below ground. And it made for an extremely difficult form of asymmetric warfare, because every time Israel succeeded in clearing some section of a Gaza city and tried to move on, a week later, the Hamas fighters would emerge from the tunnels and recapture the area that had just been cleared. So it was an extremely difficult war. And that is why, from the beginning, leaders of the IDF warned the government that this was not a war that could be won, and that it had to be fought only with an aim of achieving a quick ceasefire and the return of hostages. That was the military view from very early on. But Israel has the worst government in its history, a government that committed itself to total victory and pursued a war aimed at total victory, which meant a war which in the beginning observed some of the constraints and then at some points abandoned the constraints or seemed to abandon the constraints. And
But do you think there was a different way to fight this war? Because sometimes people mention the United States Army in Mosul in Iraq as one of the very few examples of a successful operation in a city, trying to recapture the city. So do you think there was a different way to fight the war in Gaza, or the moment when you mobilize the army and you decide to fight with the army instead of simply with intelligence or with I don't know, anything else that you can do, like diplomacy or killings or whatever. But the moment you transform this in a war, the outcome is bloody and terrible.
well, first of all, the Israelis did not understand the extent and the real effect of the underground city.
Mhm.
That came in in time. Um, uh, I think Mosul is not a very good example of the civilian death toll was very high in Mosul. Um, uh, and it, but yes, there was there was a victory. Um, uh, remember, you had an on the ground Iraqi force. The
Mhm.
Americans were fighting from the air and responding to calls for air support from the ground. Um, but there were 9,000 mostly civilian casualties uh, in that battle, which which was a high price for a victory. But Israel could not have won that kind of a war. What the Americans were urging, and some Israeli officers were urging, was what they called a slow war, fighting, the, holding, holding neighborhoods, capturing maybe just one of the cities, and holding it and bringing in supplies so that you don't have starvation.
Mhm.
Um, the Israelis didn't. The Israeli siege was on and off, but there was never a steady commitment of supplies. In part because the Israelis couldn't control the distribution of the supplies, since they didn't control any part of Gaza for more than a week, and before they moved on and Hamas moved back in. Um, I don't know if there was a better strategy. I mean, I'm sure there was a better strategy. I'm just not sure what it was.
What it was. And moving to the Hamas perspective, in Italy, one influential voice is that of Francesca Albanese. She is the UN Special Rapporteur for Occupied Territories in Palestine, and she always frame the Hamas war, basically, as a post-colonial war in terms of saying Israel is an occupying power and Hamas has the right to fight, then we can discuss how it fights, but basically it is fighting for a just cause. So if we use your framework of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, do you buy this argument? Do you think it's relevant? And do you think uh, is connected to what Hamas actually does? Because if we use your framework, we can agree with Francesca Albanese without thinking that this is an excuse for what Hamas did on October 7th. So, or how do you say it?
Well, there wasn't an occupation, and not in Gaza. Hamas was the government of Gaza for the last 20 years. We can see how effective as a government it was. It was able to build this underground city. It had extensive resources. It had the capacity to build a prosperous economy in Gaza had it wanted to. It had the capacity to build shelters. Since it was planning a war, it had the capacity to build shelters for its civilian population, which it refused to do. And then it didn't allow civilians into the underground city because it wanted to maximize civilian casualties. But there was an unjust occupation, and a resistance to the occupation would have been justified had it been aimed at Israeli soldiers and police. A terrorist resistance aimed at civilian populations was never justified in any circumstances. The deliberate killing of innocent people for political effect is a crime, and unfortunately, terrorism was not the last resort of Palestinian resistance. It was virtually the first resort.
No, totally, it's totally understandable. Since we are moving to the end of our conversation, I'm curious about how do you think about the two different recent U.S. dilemmas in foreign policy? The Maduro exfiltration, kidnapping, how you call it in Venezuela, the Venezuelan operation, and now the temptation to go to war with Iran.
Yes.
So, what do you think about Venezuela? How do we explain what happened?
Look,
Was a success for the U.S. administration? And Iran, would you recommend to do a preemptive strike or whatever or not?
yes. The Venezuelan government was a brutal government, and there were 8 million people who fled this brutal government. So I believe a foreign military intervention would have been justified. It should have been organized by the neighbors of Venezuela. It should have been a pan-American intervention. The United States could have played a role, but it should not have been a unilateral intervention by the United States. It should have been a multilateral intervention. It should have started with economic sanctions. It should have started with warnings, but against a government that has effectively expelled 8 million people, a military intervention to turn that around would certainly have been justified, but not the way we did it. And if there had been a military intervention against a pan-American, a multilateral military intervention, its aim should have been the restoration of a democratic government in Venezuela, and that obviously isn't what the Americans have aimed at. They have aimed at taking over the oil industry and allowing a continuation of the same government that produced the 8 million refugees. So what happened in Venezuela is exactly the wrong way to do something which could have been done and would have been justified had it been done the right way.
And what about Iran?
Iran is I cannot predict. I cannot give you a knowledgeable prediction of what Trump is going to do in Iran. He could make a deal to invest American money in the oil industry and establish a new government led by the Revolutionary Guard, which would be as repressive as the old government.
But a few weeks ago, I mean, in the worst moment of the regime repression of protest, apparently the U.S. government and Trump, at least, were keen to use one of your arguments. So it was a humanitarian war. It
Yes,
could have been a humanitarian war. and then that stopped. That exit the question. We forgot about people killed in the streets.
Yes. The United States or Donald Trump actually encouraged the protesters, promising that the U.S. would help them, and then he did nothing. He did nothing. So uh, uh, it's possible to imagine a military response aimed at, say, the Revolutionary Guard, which was leading the repression. I don't know how precise the attack could or should have been, but that would have been the moment. The moment, the idea would have been to just actually support the protesters and bring down the regime. Now,
That didn't happen. So now there is less, let's say, a potential war would not have the same legitimacy in terms of on moral ground.
no,
So it's
no, and it wouldn't even have the same goal, because it seems as if what we are arguing for is is a nuclear disarmament of Iran, but not any kind of political challenge to the regime. We are looking to make a deal with the regime.
yeah. Yeah. So, as a final question, I mean, you started saying that your interest in war came from, let's say, the impossibility of becoming a pacifist because you saw that some wars can be necessary, as the Second World War against the Nazi regime. So, since now there are many people in campuses, both in the US but also here in Europe, people marching in the street claiming for peace, and they call themselves pacifists. So, if you have to recommend one of two key ideas from your book that these people can find useful, interesting to, how to say, to get a more effective message in order to stop wars or to fight a just war, what would you say to them? What would be your message to these people who protest unjust wars?
Well, protesting an unjust war is a good thing to do. It has to be there has to be an actual understanding of the injustice, and there has to be a vision of uh, an end to the war that would be a just end. Um,
And in this sense, do you think that protesting the rearmament and investing in defense is something consistent with this framework, or is something that is not connected to what we do with weapons? Because these people think that if we spend more for defense, then we are preparing wars, both just and unjust, or maybe more unjust. I don't know. What do you think about this
well,
protest against the rearmament?
it's very important to pursue disarmament, but it has to be mutual disarmament. It has to be. Right now, we have abandoned the last nuclear treaty with the Russians, which is crazy. There should be every effort to limit, minimize armaments, but it has to be done in on a mutual basis. The classic case is the British left in the 1930s opposing rearmament in the face of Nazi Germany. Churchill was right and the left was wrong. Um, that was a time when rearmament was justified, necessary. So it's always situational. Um, the political battle should be for mutual disarmament, effective treaties limiting the weapons available to all sides. But if there is a military buildup by an, an expansionist regime, then counter buildups may be necessary.
Thank you so much, Professor Walzer, because you're always very effective in explaining that things are more complex than the black and white simplification that we find sometimes on TV or on social media. So I'm pretty sure that people reading your book will find a very helpful framework to deal with these complexities. So I'm very glad that we have it again in Italian, and I hope that many people will read it. I took very much of your time, so extremely grateful, and I just have to thank you again and I hope that we will not have many opportunities in the future to discuss about wars, but simply to discuss about the past. But unfortunately, this is not the case for the moment.
Yes, I agree with your hope.
Thank you again, and thank you to all the people that connected with us. And you can rewatch the conversation on YouTube and Spotify, and please share Appunti to all your network. Thank you again. Bye
Thank,
bye.
bye.